Imagine a luxurious mansion, white marble, crystal chandeliers, and a master of the house, whose life is a continuous circle of luxury and power. But behind this facade lurks something dark. This billionaire, that embodiment of power and cruelty, daily humiliates his black maid, whom he considers an inferior being. He easily hurls insults at her, not even realizing that her father once saved his life in terrible trouble. What would you do in her shoes? Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching from, because we want to get to know each and every one of you. Your feedback helps us promote the channel, and each of your reactions inspires us to create stories like this. We value every viewer, and it's important to us that you watch this video. It keeps us going and motivates us to tell stories that tug at our heartstrings. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. The majestic mansion towered over the green hills like an ancient castle, built not for comfort, but to display wealth and power. Massive white columns rose to the sky, holding up a heavy roof decorated with bas-reliefs in the style of ancient palaces. Huge doors of dark wood with golden inlays seemed to say to all who entered, "This is no place for random people." The courtyard was flooded with a steady white light of expensive lanterns, and the garden, built as if according to the drawings of the most famous gardeners, stretched for several acres around the house. The billionaire didn't build the mansion for his family, for joyful gatherings, and certainly not for warmth. He'd invested millions here for one reason only: to make every corner of his house scream money. The floors were white marble, gleaming as if the stone used to make them had been quarried specifically for this place. Majestic chandeliers studded with crystal hung from ceilings so high that any guest would feel dwarfed in this house. Antique paintings, each stroke of which cost a fortune, adorned the walls of the long corridors, and even the windows overlooking the garden seemed like exhibits. There was nothing superfluous here, nothing random. Every object, every detail seemed to remind everyone, "Do you see this? Do you see what real money is?" Everything around him was subject to this unyielding sense of superiority. Silk wallpaper, hand-carved furniture, tables made of rare wood. Every element of this interior was a challenge to the common man, emphasizing how far this world was from ordinary life. The owner of the mansion, Mr. Waters, was not just a rich man. He was a man who was accustomed to seeing money as power. Tall, broad-shouldered, hard-eyed, Mr. Waters possessed such a cold posture that even the air around him seemed to grow cold. His face always kept the same expression, a mixture of discontent and superiority, as if the world itself were not good enough for him. The servants in the house were so afraid of him that at his approach they lowered their eyes and stood still, as if trying to become invisible. To Mr. Waters it was natural they were mere tools, handy things for his comfort. The black employees of the house felt his icy gaze more than anyone else. To him, their existence was so insignificant that they seemed to dissolve, to become shadows if they did not perform their duties perfectly. Mr. Waters almost never looked them in the face, but when he did, there was a mixture of contempt and superiority in his gaze that frightened them to the point of trembling. He believed that their place was to serve him, and he was sure they should be grateful to be able to be in his house, to breathe his air and make his life more comfortable. He did not need to utter words to make his point. He looked upon them as insignificant beings to whom the mere fact of working for him must have been a privilege. When Mr. Waters spoke, he did so in such a way that each word cut like a knife. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. There was no need. His quiet, caustic phrases, spoken with such clear diction, always hit the target like arrows. The words incompetent, lazy, and useless became almost commonplace when he addressed those he considered inferior to himself. For the black servants, his words were a real challenge. Mr. Waters never mentioned their names, preferring generalized, impersonal addresses, as if they were not human beings, but faceless creatures to be served. His voice, quiet and cold, evoked fear. His gaze, heavy and penetrating, said one thing: "You are here only because I have decided so, and it's up to me to decide when you leave here." This man was accustomed to the world bowing to him, to people bending under his power, and the more he saw this fear, the more he became convinced that power was his birthright. Her name was Sarah, but in Mr. Waters' house the name didn't matter. She was just a girl, a black maid, or, as he sometimes said, another maid. This day was the first time she had ever been near her master. Her footsteps rumbled in the huge marble hall, and though she tried to move noiselessly, every step she took sounded as if a stranger had entered this luxurious, sterile world. The moment Mr. Waters met her gaze, it was as if time had stopped. He gave her a short, appraising look, full of contempt, as if to say, "You have no right to be here." He looked her over from head to toe, not hiding his dislike. His face was a mixture of squeamishness and superiority. He saw her as nothing more than a dirty job, a shapeless shadow that should disappear as soon as she had completed her duties. He raised an eyebrow, as if her very presence in his house were an insult to him. "Watch where you're going." His voice was quiet, but cold as a blade. "And if you don't know how to be inconspicuous, you better leave at once." Sarah lowered her head, not daring to meet his gaze again. Every word he said seemed to scorch her like a burn, to penetrate her to the bone. She knew that in his eyes she was nothing, that her labor, her existence here, was no more to him than another hateful duty he was forced to endure. When Sarah tried to speak, his face contorted in more contempt, and he interrupted her before she could finish her sentence. "There's nothing to say. You're not hired for this," he said, waving his hand as if he were shooing away a pesky fly. She was just another black maid, and that, Mr. Waters thought, was what limited her duties: serving, cleaning, disappearing. Her whole being to him was the epitome of Rome, of law, and her every gesture confirmed it in his mind. He wouldn't miss a chance to remind her of her place, and the more Sarah tried to be inconspicuous, the more the very fact of her existence irritated him. "And don't forget," he added without looking at her, as if he were talking to a blank slate, "any stains on the carpets or the furniture will be deducted from your paycheck." Oh, his lips twisted into a cold grin. "That should be routine for someone like you." Sarah held back her tears, knowing there was no way he would see her weakness. She went back to her duties, feeling his every word as if he were putting an invisible chain around her neck, squeezing it tighter and tighter. Sarah tried to move as quietly and smoothly as possible, as if trying to blend into the shadows. Her goal was to avoid attracting Mr. Waters' attention, but despite her efforts, his gaze found her again and again, and every gesture, every sound, every casual movement seemed to tug at his dark strings of irritation. Once, when she brought him freshly brewed tea and set the tray carefully on the table, her hand trembled slightly, the cup shook for a moment, and the tea spilled onto the saucer. Mr. Waters raised his eyes to her with cold anger, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "How many times do I have to tell you?" His voice was quiet but icy. "You're not even capable of something as simple as pouring tea, are you?" She tried to whisper something, barely parting her lips, but he quickly raised his hand, stopping her, as if any word she might have said was not only useless, but deeply offensive to him. "Shut up," he interrupted her. "I don't want an apology. I don't want to hear a sound from you. Be thankful that I can still tolerate your presence here." Sarah nodded slowly, slouching fearfully, and lowered her head so that she would not meet his gaze again. But it was the gesture her gaze lowered to the floor, emphasizing her silent submission, that brought a new wave of anger into him. "You know," he continued, mockingly, "your gaze had better never meet mine. Keep your eyes on the floor. You don't deserve to look at me." He deliberately moved closer to her, and Sarah felt his cold, penetrating breath close to her. It was as if Mr. Waters were looking for an excuse to humiliate her again, blowing every little slip-up into a gigantic sin. She stood in front of him, silent, trying to breathe shallowly so as not to give away the shiver that ran through her body. "Funny, isn't it?" he went on, not hiding his contempt. "You're hired to do a job, but you can't even stand up properly. Maybe it's in your blood, or is it part of your culture?" He emphasized the last word deliberately, mockingly, as if to emphasize that she would never understand the culture of the true greatness to which he belonged. His every word was like red-hot metal, burning her soul. Sarah continued to stand there, frowning with terror, afraid to do anything that might increase his anger. She knew that every gesture she made, every look she gave him, was just an excuse for him to enjoy the humiliation he was inflicting on her with such cruel pleasure. And don't make eye contact with me when I walk by," he added, taking a step back but still looking at her, as if she were a stain on the perfectly clean floor of his mansion. "Even when I'm not looking, I feel the stares of people like you on me. You're here to work, not to try to step out of your shadow." Sarah nodded, fighting the urge to get as far away from here as possible, but knew it was impossible. She was nothing more than a shadow in this house, a tool to be used, abused, but in no way respected. She stayed where she was, silent and invisible as she was required to, keeping her eyes on the floor, knowing that any show of courage would only make her worse. And yet, deep down, every humiliating look, every insulting word of Mr. Walters only strengthened in her a strange sense of determination not to let him break her completely, not to let his cold hatred become her destiny. To Mr. Walters, Sarah was no more than part of the interior of his huge house. Her silent presence, her silent footsteps, were like furniture to him, like an old chair to which it paid no attention, but expected it always to stand in its place. He could walk through the house, see a glimpse of her cleaning or at the kitchen counter, and his gaze would glide past her with the same indifference as it did past the walls or the windows. She was only a black maid, and he did not seem to see anything wrong in that, nor did he find any shame in it. It was natural to him that such as she should quietly run errands without attracting attention. He never wondered about her life, her thoughts or feelings. Her shadow could disappear from his mansion forever, and it wouldn't even notice except for the minor inconvenience of having to find a replacement. He recalled his father telling him as a child that such men were made to serve, and that they should be grateful for the opportunity to be useful. "These people know their place," his father repeated, and Mr. Walters accepted those words as an undeniable truth, based on his right to be superior to others. He had grown up imbibing from childhood the idea that the color of one's skin determined one's destiny, and he had never had the slightest doubt about it. Sarah, with her quiet and silent presence, was to him like an old painting on the wall that he had long since gotten used to. She always stayed in the background, doing whatever he demanded, never allowing herself a single act of defiance. She knew her place was here, in the shadow of his luxury, and not an inch more. She was trained to be invisible, a shadow that would not attract attention, would not disturb her master's peace in any way. And yet, sometimes, when Sarah passed, he sensed something irritating, almost sinister, in her silence. At those moments, he mentally rebuked her even for that invisible shadow, for the unspoken thought she might be hiding beneath her submissiveness, and, to suppress even a hint of her own dignity, he reminded her at every opportunity how small her role was. "You're not supposed to be here," he said once as she crossed the hall, lingering in his field of vision for a second. "Shadows don't walk through a house. Shadows stay behind the threshold. Your duties here do not imply that I should notice you." To him, Sarah was a mere detail of convenience, a shadow whose existence only emphasized his own greatness and power. His wealth, his house, his influence, all of it was proof that a world in which men like Sarah served and he commanded was right. Mr. Walters often returned to his thoughts about the right order of things. His world was built on a hierarchy that he considered natural, immutable, almost sacred. He was certain there were those who were meant to rule, create, and achieve greatness, and there were those who were meant only to serve. He liked to think that this was the great justice of life. To him, people like Sarah were part of the lower class, those who, in his opinion, were simply incapable of existing except on the periphery. He believed that her place here, in the shadow of his wealth, was her highest achievement, a chance to be useful despite her natural unworthiness. In his rare moments of leisure, he more than once recalled his father's words, which sounded in his mind like an undeniable truth. These people were born to labor, nothing more. They should be grateful that they are given the opportunity to serve those who rule the world. In his eyes, Sarah was as invaluable as she was capable of being comfortable. Her labor, her submission, and her silence were what defined her worth, and he didn't even consider the possibility that there might be something more behind it. Her human dignity, thoughts, feelings, those were empty words to him, irrelevant to her. He believed that Sarah and her kind could never understand or appreciate greatness, not his wealth, not his mansion, and certainly not his own life. She was born to kneel before the likes of me, he thought, convincing himself that he was right. They're incapable of higher achievements, don't even know what it is to have real power, to be able to rule, to really live. They don't need greatness or freedom. They live only to satisfy the needs and whims of those who really run the world. These thoughts were not just a comfort to him, but an unshakable certainty. And the more Sarah pleased him, the more he became convinced of his position. She was to him a model of obedience, proof that the system built on the divisions of race and class was justified and correct. When he saw her bent figure dusting priceless antique vases, or her bowed head as she carefully set his table, he mentally chuckled, thinking that it must be easy enough for her to be around such greatness as he was. Her life is already full of meaning because she serves me, Mr. Waters thought contentedly as he watched her work once again. Every time he passed by, he tried to throw some sarcastic comment at her, as if he took pleasure in the fact that he could humiliate her even silently. In his eyes, it was her natural role to obey, to serve, to remain in the shadows, and he knew that, in his opinion, it was the right order of things. Sarah was once again in the role of victim. Her life continued to be an endless alternation of humiliation and accusations. That day, like so many others, she was doing a chore, cleaning the large library, where there were massive wooden shelves filled with old books that remembered centuries. Her movements were restrained and careful, trying not to hurt any of the expensive items, but it seemed like it was only a matter of time before she did. As Mr. Waters entered the library, his gaze fell momentarily on the cover of one of the books that lay out of place. At that moment, his face contorted into an expression of rage, and he stepped closer, like a predator preparing to attack. "How could you?" he exclaimed, flicking the books off the shelf, as if they were nothing more than scraps of paper. "Don't you know how to behave in a decent house? Are all these books a waste of time to you?" Sarah squirmed fearfully and felt her heart racing. She didn't know what had gone wrong, but she knew it was just another reason for his rage. She lowered her eyes to the floor, trying not to utter a word. "I don't want to hear your excuses," he interrupted her, as if he guessed her thoughts. "It's typical of people like you to always mess things up, to always leave a mess. You just can't do anything right." His voice was full of contempt, and with each word, she felt his anger clench her throat, preventing her from saying anything. She knew that any word she said would only add fuel to the fire. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Waters continued, "Do you really think you have the right to be here, working for me? You're nothing, just a subhuman who can't even perform such simple tasks." Sarah felt tears come to her eyes, but she knew not to show weakness. She had been in this house too long not to realize that it would only make things worse for her. She held herself back, swallowing the lump in her throat, and continued to remain silent, submitting to his will. "If I had known that someone so incompetent would take this place, I would have been better off without a servant," he shouted, waving his arms as if every word he said was a weapon aimed at her. "I can't afford to have such an underdeveloped creature in the house. You are a disgrace to this house." Every word he said came out with such fury that Sarah felt her soul shrink with fear and humiliation. She felt that despite her best efforts, her life was nothing but an endless stream of accusations and scorn. Every time she thought she had hit rock bottom, he found a new way to humiliate her, to make her even more defenseless. "Don't you dare look up at me when I'm talking to you," he interrupted her silence again, forcing her to lower her gaze again. "You are not worthy of even a glance from me. Just go away and give me peace." At that moment, Sarah felt a dark feeling growing inside her, a thirst for justice. But she knew that now was not the time for resistance. She bowed her head again, and without a word, she silently left the room, leaving behind her not only the scattered books, but also a part of her hope that she would someday be able to escape this endless hell of humiliation. Breathing heavily, Sarah tried to get her thoughts in order as she walked through the hallways of the mansion, avoiding Mr. Waters' gaze. Each of his humiliations left an unhealed wound on her soul, but she knew that if she wasn't careful, he could explode again. His words, "You're not worthy of even a glance from me," kept echoing in her head. It only emphasized that her life in this house was nothing but an unbearable struggle for survival. The silence was piercing that evening when Sarah encountered him again in the dining room. She was setting the table, trying to do everything quickly and neatly, but, as so often happened, her efforts did not go unnoticed. When he saw her uncertain movement, he couldn't help but exclaim, "Why are you here if you don't know how to serve?" His voice was full of contempt, as if he poisoned every word. "Look at you. You look like you don't know how to handle the dishes at all." Sarah frowned, her heart clenched with fear. She realized she couldn't afford to be wrong. Her every gesture, every movement was under the microscope of his scornful gaze. But fear kept her in its grip. She swallowed hard and tried to find words to justify herself, but she knew he didn't want to hear her explanation. "You're not even worthy of my attention," he continued, raising his voice. "Every time I look at you, I am ashamed that you even have the audacity to be in this house. You know that people like you shouldn't be here, don't you?" His words were like pricks piercing her heart. He took every opportunity to remind her of her place in the world. Sarah felt her face flush with shame and a feeling of powerlessness rise in her chest. She didn't want to be part of this humiliating performance, but she knew she had no choice. "Your hands are made only for work, not for thinking," he interrupted her thoughts, noting the way her eyes sparkled for a moment. "Don't you dare dream of anything more than that. You are just a black maid, and your existence has no meaning." His every word burned her like hot metal. He was clearly enjoying her suffering, and that feeling of humiliation spread through her body. She knew she had to keep silent, that she mustn't let him see how his words hurt her. "Why should I keep such a mediocrity here?" he continued, ignoring her silence. "You should feel happy that you can serve me, but you don't even seem to realize it." Sarah lowered her head further, trying to hide the tears that came to her eyes. Her life had been full of suffering, but none as deep as this humiliating hopelessness. It was as if his contempt was a reflection of everything she'd been through, and she didn't know how to deal with it. "And don't think you can run away from your responsibilities," he added, his gaze full of contempt. "You belong to me, and that will never change." Those words, spoken with such hatred, seemed to cut her from the inside. With each phrase, with each derogatory rebuke, she felt her soul tighten, and the fear that gripped her grew stronger. Sarah realized that in this house, she would always be but a shadow, but a black servant, called to do his whims and obey his will. Every moment of her life in this mansion reminded her of how much she had been humiliated, and this suffering was unbearable. Sarah stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the gloom that was like her faithful companion. She could not hold back the tears that rolled down her cheeks, but she knew she must hide them. Every rebuke, every humiliating word from Mr. Walters stung her soul, leaving wounds that would not heal. But despite everything, she couldn't let him see her weakness. "Why does he hate me so much?" she asked herself, lost in the endless stream of her thoughts. His words were tearing her up inside, but she knew that any attempt to answer would only make her worse. In this house, silence was her only weapon, her only defense against the fury of his contempt. Every time he inflamed the atmosphere with his attacks, she pressed her lips together, forcing herself to shut up. Her body shook with repressed emotion, but she tried not to think about it. "He has the power," she whispered to herself, "but I have my fortitude." Her inner voice became her only friend, the one who reminded her that even in silence, she still retained her humanity. After his humiliating words, when she was alone, her heart shrank with pain. Tears flowed as she tried to embrace her soul, but a realization grew inside her. Despite the humiliation, she was still alive, and maybe that was all that mattered. She remembered her father, the man who had been her hero and source of strength. He had taught her resilience, explained that there would always be those in life who would want to crush, but true strength lay in the ability to hold on. "He won't let him break me," she decided firmly, inhaling deeply and wiping away her tears. "I can't survive this. I have to stay strong so that I can be free one day." When she re-entered the hall, every cell in her body was full of contradictions, fear, bitterness, repressed rage. She held herself up as if broken, but not broken, even as he continued to throw derogatory words in her face. She refused to give him what he wanted so badly: to see her suffering, to see her tears, to see his humiliation undermine her. When he looked at her with contempt again, she decided to ignore him. Every time his sarcastic voice sounded in her ears, she remembered how her father had saved his life, how he had once been heaven to him, and now he, the same man, was making her his victim? I will not be his victim, she repeated to herself, feeling her chest fill with determination. Even if his words were bullets aimed at her heart, she continued to stand like a fortress, sheltered behind the walls of her own silence. Sarah knew that her time would come, and one day she would be able to tell her story. The story of her pain, her suffering, and how she had withstood all the humiliation with dignity. She focused her thoughts again and, trying not to show her feelings, continued her work. Every step, every movement was an act of resistance for her. Her silence was not weakness, it was her strength, her armor against injustice, and she knew that even in the shadows, she still possessed a soul that could not be broken. Sarah moved slowly down the hallway, leading a cart with clean towels and fresh bedding for the guest rooms. Her thoughts, as usual, were busy struggling with the overwhelming sense of humiliation. But at this moment, they returned to the one memory that held her afloat like a strong anchor in a turbulent ocean of misery. She remembered her father, how much she had loved him, a man with an unshakable spirit. He had always taught her resilience and kindness, even when the world around them was breaking down. But his true feet remained forever beyond her comprehension. She knew that he was not just a simple laborer, as many thought, but a true hero. It was many years ago when her father, working in a small town, happened to be in the right place at the right time. One day when Lil Waters, then a child, got lost in the woods and got into trouble, he encountered a wild animal that was very aggressive. No one knew how quickly events developed, but her father, risking his life, stood up in defense of the frightened boy. He drove the beast away without thinking about the consequences for himself. This story, full of courage and sacrifice, had always been in her heart, but she could not tell it to anyone. How could she tell the men who, like a shadow, surrounded her with hatred and contempt, without even realizing that his life had been saved by her father? He placed more and more importance on racial superiority every day, not seeing that his savior had one day become part of his own life. In those rare moments when she was alone with herself, a strange feeling enveloped her. It was a feeling that she could make a difference. Perhaps she could make him remember that story, if only for a moment. But how? His pride was impenetrable, and she understood that he would never allow himself to believe that a black maid could be a part of his past, especially if he found out that her father was his savior. With this memory, full of pride and love, came the dark shadow of her inner struggle. She could not forget that all this time this man, thinking himself majestic, had humiliated and insulted her. He had never noticed that behind the outer layer of unworthiness was a story that could change everything. Sarah felt a storm rising in her chest, a thirst for justice, a thirst to explain to him that he was inadvertently degrading his life by refusing to learn his true value. She held this secret inside her like a gem she didn't know what to do with. Should she ever reveal the truth about her father? Or perhaps that would be her only path to freedom, to recognize her importance and the strength she had inherited from him. With every drop of humiliation she experienced, her determination to grow and thrive increased. This secret she had kept for so long could become her strength. But would she be ready to reveal it one day? Every day that she faced the billionaire, that thought became even harder to contain. After all, even he, beneath the majestic marble walls of his home, was just a man who had once experienced fear and defenselessness just like she had. With every minute she spent with him, the question grew in her mind like a weed in a flowering garden. What would happen if he ever learned the truth? Maybe this was her chance for redemption, a chance to make him see that there was something more behind every humiliation, something beyond his racial bias. But could she ever find the strength and courage to uncover the truth? Sarah continued with her duties, but her thoughts kept returning to the fateful day when her father had become a hero. Those memories were a bright spot in her dark life, and she tried to make them matter, even as life around her became increasingly gray. The image of the forest came back to her mind, thick and dark and full of rustles, where the darkness hid more than just trees. It was the summer when her father, young and full of vigor, had gone for a walk in the surrounding woods, not suspecting that fate would lead him to a little boy who was no more than 7 years old. This boy, Waters, wandered among the trees, frightened and lost, until his world was filled with terror. The moment a wild cat, hungry and dangerous, came between him and rescue, her father appeared as if he had come down from heaven. He didn't think of himself, didn't consider that his life was in danger. He just knew he had to save this boy. As he leaped forward, lunging at the game, his heart pounded with fear, but he couldn't afford to back down. First the child, then me, he thought as he struggled with the predator, snatching it from the clutches of death. Though he managed to drive the beast away, his body remained wounded and exhausted. He came out of the forest the next morning with a heavy head and dashed hopes, but his heart was aflame with the certainty that he had done the right thing. Sarah had always known that day was a turning point in their family's life, though no one knew how it affected another person's life. But the billionaire seemed oblivious to the fact that his life had once been saved, to the fact that someone who looked just like her had become his protector in that moment. Every time she looked into Mr. Waters' eyes, she wanted to scream, to share this story and remind him that he should appreciate those around him. But instead, she only continued to remain silent like a shadow, suffering through his cruel words. His arrogance and hatred, like a bullhorn, thickened around her, making her existence unbearable. But what if she decides to tell him the truth? What if she found the courage to say, "You are not just a rich man. You are a man whose life was saved thanks to my father." A hero in that tragic moment, but immediately fear clutched her heart. What if he doesn't believe her? Or worse, what if he thought this story was just an attempt to make him feel sorry for her? Sarah realized that her father had paid a high price for his kindness, and it only emphasized how low the billionaire had fallen, humiliating her and overlooking her human worth. As a man who had once been saved, he was now a hunter himself, stalking her, making her a victim of his racial superiority. Every day, this inner struggle became harder and harder. The feeling that her story might change him, break the cycle of hatred and contempt, never left her. She imagined how his view of her might change if he knew the truth, how his pride might give way to understanding. But no matter how hard she tried, her fear always stopped her at the edge. While her father remained a hero in her memory, the billionaire continued to be her executioner, and their paths crossed in hatred and contempt, while the true story of their bond remained hidden from the world. Amidst this inner conflict, Sarah knew she had to find a way to uncover this truth before it was too late. She had to make sure that her father's story, his sacrifice and kindness, would finally see the light of day and be known to someone who might be able to realize who she really was. Mr. Waters Saturday in his huge office, its windows overlooking the vast ocean, the golden light of the setting sun reflected in his luxurious interiors, creating an atmosphere of grandeur and success, as if the world itself were at his feet. He counted his accomplishments, giving himself importance, as if he were stacking up riches, collecting each of his victories like a jewel in an incredible crown. "I did it on my own," he thought, stroking confidently the expensive furniture made just for him. "No one helped me along the way." His thoughts circled around the constant mantra of self-sufficiency, that he had achieved everything through his efforts, his talent, and of course the luck that had come along with it. For him, there were no other factors that could explain his success. There were no family, friends, or even random benefactors, just him and his perseverance. Every morning he rose with the certainty that the world was an arena where only the strongest would win. He did not believe in the exploits of others. All the stories of valor, of sacrifice, seemed to him only fairy tales for weaklings, attempts to justify his own failures. Why should I burden myself with other people's stories? He wondered, turning them away from him like unnecessary junk. It never occurred to him that there was much more behind his successes than just personal effort. He didn't see those who labored in the background were those who had once saved his life. His pride blinded his mind, and there was no room for gratitude. "Everything I have is the result of my actions," he thought, convincing himself he was right. His arrogance reached its limit when he thought of his enemies, those who could not compare to him. "They all just don't understand." He thought scornfully of those who couldn't walk the same path as him. "My life is my game, and no one else has the right to interface with it." Every step, every success sharpened his confidence that he was the only one who was truly valuable in this world. In his mind, the maid was just another link in the chain, just a faceless creature needed for his comfort. How could she possibly think herself important? He thought, showering her with contempt at every glance. To him, she was nothing more than decoration, some element that kept him well off. He never thought of her past, of her pain, of her connection to his own childhood. As the evening faded, he sat in his chair, listening to the sounds of the city, unaware that behind him lurked a secret that could shake his world. He didn't notice how all his achievements might be built on the basis of other people's sacrifice and suffering. Instead, he repeated to himself, "I owe everything to myself." That phrase sounded like a spell that filled his life. I am who I am. I have achieved this without help, and no one has the right to judge me for it. With these thoughts, he felt invincible, as if he could outshine the world on his own. And yet, in the back of his mind, somewhere in the shadow of his arrogance, there was a vague feeling that he might be wrong, but he quickly dismissed that feeling as an unwelcome guest, unwilling to let thoughts of those he had humiliated, of those who had once risked their lives for him, into his life. There was no choice for him but to keep moving forward on the road paved with his own successes, cutting any ties to those who may have once saved him. Every day he chose to remain blind to his own story, no matter how much it wanted to be heard. Sarah stood in that kitchen, cutting vegetables for dinner, but her thoughts were far from the kitchen, far from the pungent smells of fresh produce and the sounds of pots and pans. There was an unbearable bitterness in her heart. How unfair it was that the very person who should feel gratitude for life was now, in effect, taking her own existence away from her, making it unbearable. Working as a slave that thought tormented her, she felt trapped by the man whose life had been saved by her father's sacrifice. This terrible paradox, this twisted circle of fate filled her soul with an oppressive sense of betrayal. Every time she heard his sarcastic remarks about her incompetence, she felt the burning sensation of his words, as if he were shouting to her, "You are nothing." The old memories of the day her father had rushed into battle for little waters filled her mind again. How he'd risked everything for someone else's child, relying only on his own strength and kindness, not even thinking about the fact that his life might turn on him. He had always been her hero, always taught her that kindness and compassion were the greatest virtues, but how those ideals had been eroded in light of the cruelty with which the billionaire had treated her. Every rebuke, every humiliation flashed through her mind like fiery sparks, tearing her inner world apart. Why didn't he remember? She asked herself, growing even more painful. Why doesn't he remember that someone risked their life for him? She could feel that unbearable feeling of pent-up anger fueling her inner fire, turning her bitterness into shame. Yes, her father hadn't just saved a life. He'd given the chance to live to someone who now looked at her humanity as dirt beneath his feet. How could he be so ruthless? His every derogatory word burned her like red-hot metal, making her feel even more vulnerable and subjugated. Nevertheless, in this terrible humiliation, in this constant pressure, she realized more and more that her father's deed was not merely an act of kindness, but a seed of strength that she carried within her. She was his daughter, and this bond obliged her to cherish his memory, his sacrifice. Increasingly aware of her uniqueness, she tried to remember what her father had always said: humility is not weakness. It is strength hidden beneath the surface. And now, in this gloomy house, among marble walls filled with contempt and arrogance, she had to let that strength awaken. She raised her eyes to the majestic portraits of him hanging on the walls and felt the anger begin to give way to determination. Every time he spoke contemptuously of her, she took aim. I won't let it stop. I will not let his arrogance demean my father and his valor. With each day, she tried to gather her strength to remember his exploits, that her life was not just a shadow, not just service. She felt that despite all the humiliation, she could be something more. That idea lit a spark in her that drove her forward. Even when fear and shame tried to stop her, she knew that one day she would have to tell him the truth. She would have to do it not only for herself, but for the memory of her father, that hero who had once risked everything to save a life that the billionaire, like a blind man, didn't even know about. That thought became her navigation, guiding her through the dark times she lived in, promising that she would not forget who she was. With each passing day, Sarah continued to do her job, trying to ignore the humiliation and insults that fell on her like rain. She felt her patience becoming a test in the face of fate. Like a test she had to pass before she could change her life. Every step in this luxurious mansion, among the marble walls and gold, seemed to her not just a chore, but part of something bigger, a challenge she must overcome. Sarah made a decision. She would endure. She knew her father had never given up, even when faced with adversity, and that gave her strength. When the billionaire threw her another rebuke, when his contemptuous laughter resonated in her ears, she tried to remind herself that every humiliation was not only his weakness, but her opportunity to become stronger. "I am not a slave," she whispered to herself. "I am the daughter of a hero." She spent her days washing dirty plates and cleaning up messes. But even in these little things, she found small moments of peace. In the privacy of the kitchen, when the sounds of the rest of the house had subsided, she often thought of her father, how he had proudly served his community, how he had fought for truth and justice. Those memories became her anchor, keeping her afloat in a stormy sea of humiliation. Nevertheless, every one of her patience was put to the test. One day, when she finished cleaning the hall, the billionaire came home with a new bout of rage. He stormed into the room, not noticing her rubbing her hands together nervously, waiting for him to start humiliating her again. He was furious, and her heart beat faster when she realized his anger was directed at her. "Why didn't you clean this room properly?" His sharp remark ran through the air. Sarah felt her insides clench, but she only replied quietly, "I'm sorry." To her, it was only one look, but it was full of contempt that flickered across his face like a hurricane. She could feel his words penetrating her like blades, leaving wounds that she had to hide. Her patience was being tested to the limit at this moment, and she fought the urge to tell him the truth about her father, about the bond that bound them together. But every time she felt ready to break the silence, fear gripped her. What if he just brushes it off? She thought. What if he laughed and said her father's sacrifices were worth nothing to his greatness? Each humiliation tested not only her patience, but also her resolve. She knew she had to find a way to survive this hell without losing herself or her honor. Her humility became her strength, and each day, each moment of struggle strengthened her inner fire. Sarah learned to hold her head up even as the world around her crumbled. She became an expert in the art of silent confrontation. And though the billionaire never knew that he wasn't really fighting a faithless maid, but the daughter of his savior, she kept the secret in her heart, hoping that one day she would find a way to reveal it to him. Every night when she went outside, breathing the fresh air and the stars shining above her, she took a step toward her dream, to the dream of justice, of having her story told. She knew that fate had brought them together again for a reason. Perhaps this meeting was her chance to change not only her own life, but the life of a man who had once been saved by her father's sacrifice. She was going to overcome all challenges so that one day she could be free, and though her path was thorny, she felt she had the strength to go for it despite everything. Her humility was her test, and she was ready to pass it, knowing that behind her patience was something greater, her own story that was still waiting to be told. With each new day, it seemed to Sarah that the humiliation she was experiencing was becoming more and more unbearable. Every word of the billionaire burned her soul, leaving behind eternal wounds that never healed, but only deepened. "You are nothing, worthless." It sounded in her ears like a spell that poisoned her thoughts and tore at her heart. Sarah knew he wasn't just humiliating her, he was trying to break her will, make her forget who she really was. She felt each insult penetrating her skin, like sharp needles cutting into her inner world. Slave, unworthy, mediocre, these words rolled around in her head like a hurricane, giving her no rest, but she couldn't let him take over her mind. She knew that those words hid only his own powerlessness. Every time he looked up at her disdainfully, she tried to remember who her family was, what they represented. Her father, who taught her pride and dignity. Despite all the hardships they had to overcome, he didn't give up when the world was against him. He risked his life for another person, expecting nothing in return. The memory of him was her only support in dark times. She often mentally returned to the way her father talked about his youth, how he worked to feed his family, how he never let himself get discouraged. "We're not slaves, Sarah," he said. "We're a free people, and we alone determine who we are." Those words echoed in her head like a low whisper as the billionaire insulted her for yet another shortcoming. Every time he spoke the derogatory words, she gathered all her strength not to show her fear. "They're just words," she told herself. They can't break what they can't see. In these moments, she imagined her father looking at her proudly, as if to say, "You are stronger than they think. You can withstand anything." Sarah had learned to hide her emotions, to hide her tears behind a smile that no one could see. She walked the corridors of the mansion, trying to fulfill her duties, but a storm raged inside her. Every humiliated word tore at her heart, but she continued to clench her fists, letting the pain become her driving force. She had to survive. She had to remember that her suffering was not in vain. One day, when the billionaire started attacking her again with ruthless accusations, her heart was filled with determination. "You will not break me," she shouted in her inner world. She realized that this moment wasn't just a test, it was an opportunity to show herself and him that she was not just a maid, but the daughter of a man who had once been a hero. Every burn, every humiliating word became not just a source of pain for her, but a reminder of who she was. She collected those memories like jewels to turn them into power. It was her weapon against hatred, her secret knowledge that even in the darkest corners of humiliation, light could be found. Although her life seemed bleak, she did not allow herself to fall into despair. With each humiliation, her spirit grew stronger, and she knew that despite everything, her story would still be heard. She wasn't just a shadow in this house, she was a living testament to the struggle, strong and resilient, and one day, she would give this house new meaning, freeing herself from the tyranny of the words that tried to break her. Wealth and power became for the billionaire not just a means, but a real armor protecting him from everything he considered degrading. In his eyes, money was not just capital, it was his lifeline that kept him on the surface, away from the dangerous abyss of poverty. The fear of poverty, which lurked in the depths of his soul like a sinister specter, made him despise even more those who, in his opinion, were beneath him. When he looked at his employees, especially the black maid, his gaze was full of not only contempt but panic fear. He saw in her not just a person, but a symbol of everything that could threaten his comfortable life. Every time she seemed to dare to raise her head, his heart clenched with fear. What if she remembered who she really was? He thought, what if she rebels against me one day? These thoughts only fueled his arrogance. He told himself that his wealth was the merit of his labor alone, and therefore anyone who could not reach that level was worthy of contempt. If you are poor, it means you are inept, lazy and worthless. These beliefs were firmly fixed in his mind. He did not realize that behind every face of poverty, there were stories of struggle and sacrifice. With every humiliation he poured out on Sarah, he forgot that her father had once saved his life, that she was not just a faceless servant, but a member of an entire generation that had survived under conditions he had never known. He savored his superiority, forgetting that it was because of others, the less privileged, that made him who he was. In his eyes, poverty wasn't just a social status, it was a plague he tried to avoid with all his might. He surrounded himself with people who praised him and hated those who would remind him that he could have been in their shoes. This fear erupted in his behavior. Every time he entered into a conversation with someone from a lower class, his tone became harsher, his words more barbed. He did not realize that this hatred of others only emphasized his own vulnerability. When he looked at Sarah, he saw only an inferior being whose only function was to serve him. He did not realize that her humility, despite his humiliation, was a sign of strength, not weakness. His disregard for her was a mask for his own fears. He was afraid of losing everything he had, and so he tried his best to humiliate those who, in his opinion, were not worth even a piece of bread. With each humiliation, Sarah could feel his fear only intensifying his cruelty. She knew his words were a reflection of his inner struggle, his fear of losing what he had. This realization gave her a new strength. She couldn't change him, but she could change herself. She could maintain her honor and pride despite his attempts to break her. She walked down the corridors of the mansion, absorbed in her thoughts, and every step was proof of her steadfastness. Soon, she thought, everything will change. He won't be able to break me. I am not just a maid. I am the daughter of a man who knew what true valor was. The billionaire's fear of poverty and contempt for the lower classes only deepened her resolve. Every humiliated word was not only a source of pain for her, but also a reminder that she should never let fear define her life. She was going to show him that beneath his arrogance was only fear, not strength, and that fear would one day become his own evil. The light streaming in through the dining room's large windows played on the shining marble surfaces, giving the whole room an air of luxury and isolation. The billionaire was seated at a long table, laden with exquisite dishes, and seemed to be enjoying his meal. But his eyes were cold and his expression absent. Silence reigned around him, broken only occasionally by the sound of cutlery. Sarah stood in the shadows, watching his every move. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held herself in check, clenching her fists to keep her emotions in check. She knew this moment was no time for weakness, but her gaze couldn't look away from his brazen confidence. His stately dinner was the epitome of everything she hated, the luxury he was accustomed to and the disdain with which he treated those who didn't have the same status. How could he sit here devouring food when she was but a shadow in his life? Every spoonful of his food, every drop of wine, seemed a mockery to her. He was surrounded by wealth, and she by the poverty he had created with his words and actions. The billionaire threw off the ordinary experiences. His family was behind, and with every bite, he showed that his life had become only a game where real human feelings had no place. How on earth can he eat without feeling an ounce of shame? She thought. How can one enjoy luxury when there is so much suffering around? Sarah knew very well that this meal was a way for him to isolate himself from the reality that surrounded him. He had driven away all thoughts of poverty, of those who could not afford such treats. He sought solace in this silent rebellion against the world around him, and all the while she remained his servant, silently serving, hiding her feelings in the depths of her heart. When he looked at her again with indifference, in slight disdain, she felt his gaze slide down her face without lingering. His assessment was cruel, and every moment she remained in the shadows turned into an eternity. How long can I put up with this? Tormented herself with the thought, but she knew it wasn't time. She had to be patient. Sarah continued to work, placing food in front of him, watching his every desire as if it were her destiny. But there was a fire burning inside her, the fire of revenge, the fire of resilience. She could see his selfishness, his fears, and it only gave her strength. He was lonely, even amidst all this luxury, even when the table was full of food. How could he be so blind? She asked herself. There were no real people in his entourage, only puppets who obeyed his whims, and among them, she was the only one who had ever dared to disobey. Every time he was angry with her, every time his words burned her soul, she grew stronger. She knew that this pain he was inflicting was not just a punishment, but a test she had to pass. As dinner drew to a close, the billionaire leaned back in his chair as if he could free himself from all his worries with a single movement. He was satisfied, but he didn't know that there was much more behind his every action than just a servant. He doesn't know, Sarah thought, that there is real power lurking beneath the shadow. She knew her time would come. In a moment, a shadow could become a light that would illuminate a dark corner of his life, forcing him to see the truth he had studiously ignored. She was ready to contain that fire, ready to light it one day, and when it did, the billionaire would no longer be able to escape the shadow he'd been creating all these years. Sarah Saturday in her tiny room, the penumbra shrouding the walls, and the barely audible sound of her host's footsteps on the first floor was a reminder that life outside her nook continued. In that instant, her thoughts drifted back in time, back to her childhood, when her father, with a smile on his face and a light in his eyes, would tell her his story. He always did it with such passion, as if he were reliving those moments himself. I was young and scared, he began, his voice like a melody full of hope and pride. I remember finding myself in that terrible situation when I didn't know how to save myself. And suddenly, amidst the chaos, I saw him, a small, frightened boy surrounded by evil. I didn't think about myself. I only thought about what I had to do to save him. Those words echoed in her memory, sending a shiver through her heart. She had always admired her father, a man who risked his own life and rushed to the aid of another. But how amazing and ironic was it that the boy he had saved had grown up to become this cruel billionaire, who now treated her father like a lowlife. Sarah remembered her father talking about that day with pride and regret. "I knew I was doing the right thing. I couldn't leave him in trouble, even if it cost me my life. I'd go for it again." His words sounded like a vow, like a guide action that she tried to keep in her heart. Now that she was facing this reality, now that the billionaire her family had talked about had become her tormentor, a deep contradiction arose in her soul. She felt the fear of his hatred and humiliation mixed with pride for her father. How could he forget that sacrifice? A thought tormented her. How could you so easily betray the memory of the man who had once saved your life? Every day when she left her room, she felt like echoes of that story haunted her. She looked at the billionaire, and in his cold eyes, she saw a reflection of fear and shame, the very feelings her father had spoken of. He doesn't know what it's like to be in trouble. He doesn't know what it's like to lose everything for another person. Sarah knew that she had to keep the story alive in her heart, that she had to be not just the daughter of the hero, but an extension of him. She couldn't let him forget that his life had been saved, and that his indifference now was not only his weakness, but his stupidity. "I'll find a way," she thought, clenching her fists. "I'll let him know that he can't just forget. I'll show him that the memory of my father's courage lives in me, and in every action I take." In the memory of the day, her father became a hero. She found the strength that allowed her to survive amidst humiliation. She knew she couldn't afford to give up. She had to remember that even in the darkest corners, where the light is suppressed, there is always hope for rebirth, for a chance to change destiny. Her gaze drifted to the future, to the time when the truth about her father would come out, and the billionaire would be able to look into the eyes of someone who not only served, but was the embodiment of his own salvation. She was going to do everything she could to make sure that day came, because her father, his hero, deserved it. The light of the evening sun shone softly through the windows, creating fanciful patterns on the walls of the mansion. Sarah stood in the shadows, watching the billionaire, who seemed to be absorbed in his own thoughts again, unaware of her presence. There was arrogance in his eyes, but also some underlying insecurity. He was blind to his own weaknesses, not realizing that his efforts to break her were only strengthening her spirit. Every look he gave, every dismissive word he uttered reflected his unconscious struggle. He had always believed that his money and power made him stronger, but now, in this quiet setting, his blindness was more than apparent. She was a reflection of him, a shadow of his lack of understanding. He didn't know that his humiliations only raised her resilience. His cruelty did not break her, but instead hardened her like steel in a fire. Sarah remembered her father teaching her to be proud of her heritage. "Never let others dictate your worth," he had told her, and those words had become her credo in life. Even as she served this arrogant man, her pride stayed with her like an invisible shield, protecting her from humiliation. She knew that her worth was not determined by his opinion of her. Every humiliated word he threw in her direction came back at him with double force. He didn't realize that she saw through his mask of confidence, that she was aware of his fears and complexes. His worry about how he was perceived by those around him only emphasized his own insecurities. She sensed that with every angry tone he used, he was losing control, and that was her secret victory. Sarah pondered how every single thing he did actually destroyed him, not her. She proudly straightened her back and looked him in the eye, even as he forced her to follow his endless orders, each time evoking more and more of her inner strength. He may have been a billionaire, but his money didn't make him a better man. His wealth only emphasized his moral poverty. Every time he uttered an insult, every time his arrogance lashed out, she felt a flame of determination ignite inside her. She wasn't just a victim, she was the keeper of her father's story, his legacy, his sacrifice. Every humiliating gesture was not just a humiliation to her, but a challenge she had to meet. She could do it, and she would. In the midst of all his attempts to break her spirit, she noticed how he was beginning to lose confidence. His words became sharper, his gestures more tense. She could see him trying to control the situation, but at the same time, she realized that his overbearing maneuvers only showed how helpless he was in his internal struggle. Each time he looked at her with contempt, she only became more aware of his power. "I'm not just a shadow in his house," she thought. "I am an extension of my father, his pride, and one day he'll see that even a shadow can be stronger than light." Sarah decided that she had to act. that it was time to show him that beneath her silence was a strength he couldn't ignore. This was her time, the moment when she had to remind him of its sacrifice, of someone who was willing to give everything to save another. It was her weapon, her perseverance, that could bring his world down on his head. She continued her duties, but now her actions were more deliberate. Every time she brought him food, every time she cleared the table, she tried to do it in a way that made him feel that she wasn't just here to serve. She's here to remind him of who she really is and who her father is. Each day, her silent pride became more apparent, and his blindness to it became more apparent. He didn't know that in this house, in this world where he was a god, his blindness was leading to his downfall. His unconscious disregard and lack of respect for her dignity was the harbinger of his own disaster. Sarah was ready. She knew that one day that day would come, the day when he would see her not just as a servant, but as an equal, as someone whose life was as important as his own. She realized that in this confrontation her steadfastness would be the deciding factor, and when it did, she would be ready to show him the true meaning of sacrifice and courage that he had so easily forgotten. The light outside the window slowly dimmed, and the evening shadows filled the luxurious rooms of the mansion. Sarah continued her daily work, and something more than the pain of humiliation ripened in her heart. It was determination to survive and defend her dignity, but at the same time, there was a sadness growing in her soul that the billionaire who had repeatedly despised her had never been able to see the true value of her existence. Every day as she passed him, she felt his arrogance and hatred blind him from understanding. His lack of understanding was becoming his punishment. Sarah knew that even as he sought further humiliation from her, his own blindness would make him vulnerable. He didn't realize that his attempts to break her spirit only exacerbated his own isolation from humanity. Every time he raised his voice, every time his words became sarcastic and demeaning, Sarah remained steadfast. She watched his confidence erode, his fears and insecurities erupt, and realized that he could never see how blind he was to his own weaknesses. His contempt for her life, her past, and her family was not just a humiliation, but proof of his own downfall. Sarah thought back to the days when her father had saved this man's life. There was not an ounce of gratitude or appreciation in his eyes, only cold arrogance. She realized that this was his karma. He would never know the truth, that his life had been saved at the cost of another man's courage, and that the one who served him today was the daughter of that hero. Every evening, when she finished her duties, she found the strength to retreat to her tiny room and meditate. Tears flowed down her cheeks, but they were tears of bitterness as well as release. He doesn't know what it's like to be part of a story that no one knows about. He doesn't realize that his blindness is leading to his defeat. Even though she was just a maid in his mansion, her resilience and patience became her strength, her weapon in this unequal battle. Time passed, and the billionaire continued to live his life, immersed in his own worries and not realizing that a real drama was unfolding around him. His world remained as isolated and arrogant as ever, and her presence became just a habit. He didn't notice how every time he voiced his preconceived opinions about inferior beings, it only showed his ignorance and fear of what he couldn't control. Sarah realized that eventually she might be the one to point out his mistakes, but it wouldn't be now. Perhaps it would be later. When he faced the consequences of his blindness, she knew that justice was not always served in this world, but she also realized that her father was right. Strength comes from within, and it lies in staying true to oneself despite all adversity. With each passing day, her patience strengthened her spirit. She continued to fulfill her duties with dignity, not letting his contempt break her, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw not just a maid, but a person proud of her heritage. She realized that her father had been a true hero, and that was her treasure. One evening, when the billionaire started hurling insults again, Sarah stood in front of him, staring at him. His words came off like sharp blades, but she felt they no longer had the power they had before. Her silence, her steadfastness, it was her armor, and perhaps that was what irritated him the most. He'll never know the truth, she thought, clenching her fists. He'll never realize that his blindness and hatred lead to his own downfall. She accepted that fact as part of her fate, and while she couldn't change him, she could change herself. She could find the strength to carry on, to live with pride and in memory of her father, who had once made a choice that stood beyond his own fear. As she walked back to her room, Sarah knew that her patience was her strength and his blindness was his punishment. She was prepared for the future, for the trials that awaited her, and even if the billionaire never learned the truth, She would continue to live with pride. She would keep the memory of her father and the courage that had once saved that man's life, and that was her true triumph. Thank you for being with us. We're interested in hearing what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories are important, and discussing them can help raise awareness and promote understanding. Each of you is very important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other important stories. We wish you a wonderful day.